Hi, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to be here today to share with you our presentation, Municipal Partnerships to Increase Recreation Access in Rural Communities. My name is Diane Fleeser. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at Disability Network West Michigan. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm a white woman who wears glasses. I have brown eyes and long brown hair. And I'm presenting today with my colleague, Brad Hastings. Brad, would you like to introduce yourself?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brad Hastings, and I'm the Advocacy and ADA Coordinator for Disability Network West Michigan. And I am a white male with blue eyes and a shaved head and a beard. And I have a tan room in the background with a guitar hanging on the wall this morning or afternoon, depending on where you are.
And we're going to move to slide 2. So the overview of our presentation today will focus on building the capacity and relationships needed to advocate for inclusive recreation opportunities in your area. We'll talk about ways to support accountability from those municipalities with service agreements and accessibility reviews. We'll quickly review accessibility basics for parks and recreation, and then we'll be sharing some specific examples of advocacy measures that we've had success with in improving recreation in our area. Moving to slide 3. Just a quick background of Disability Network West Michigan. We are one of 15 centers for independent living in the great state of Michigan. And the 5 counties we serve, 3 of them share the beautiful Lake Michigan shoreline. So on this slide, we have a map of Michigan, and we are on the west side of the state, and the 5 counties we serve are circled in red. Accessible recreation in our area has grown to be incredibly important because of the vast opportunities to recreate outdoors. We have over 300 miles of Lake Michigan shoreline, lots of sandy beaches, lighthouses, state parks, rivers, and inland lakes. And so knowing your region and some of the key features of it is a great way to dial in where you can start with some of your advocacy for accessible recreation. Moving to slide 4. So our region has one main urban center that hosts about 35,000 residents, but the majority of the surrounding area is quite rural. Outdoor recreation is huge for both locals and tourists. The tourism industry is quite vital to our local economy. So for us, this was a great way to influence positive change. With all of the parks in our area, we were noting how old the infrastructure was and how many of the local parks and opportunities for recreation needed some major updating to be more inclusive and accessible. So we have lots of hiking trails, campgrounds, playgrounds, boat launches, and marinas, but the majority of those lacked accessible features. So about 4 years ago, we started to focus more on advocating for improvements in this area specifically. And then we have an image description here, which is a picture of Lake Michigan with its sandy beach and one of our piers and lighthouses in the background. Moving to slide 5. So once the decision was made to focus more intently on accessible recreation, we reached out to other centers in our state to learn more about their experiences. And we also realized we needed a role to focus specifically on building this capacity. We, of course, like many centers, had individuals on our team who were knowledgeable on the ADA and, of course, their own lived experiences. But we felt like it was necessary to create a role specifically focused on advocating for these changes. And so that's when we made the decision to specifically hire someone in this capacity. And that's when we started working. We hired Brad, and I'm going to turn it over to him now to talk about some of the steps we took in building this capacity with his role.
Yes. So after I was brought on, one of the first priorities for getting into my role was to make sure that I was knowledgeable about the Americans with Disabilities Act and about accessibility in general. So there are quite a few opportunities for training and education around this. The biggest one that I think was most helpful for me is the ADA Coordinator Training Certification Program, which is operated by the Great Plains ADA Center out of the University of Missouri. And through that, you have to go through some coursework and take a final exam in order to get certified. The main certification there is in Title II for state and local governments, but they offer some additional training as well in Title III. There's an employment specialization now, as well as a healthcare specialization. There are also, in addition to that, there are webinars available all of the time through Accessibility Online. The regional ADA centers offer a lot of training opportunities. And also the United States Access Board. And sometimes the webinars are a collaboration between all of those entities. The Accessibility Online webinars will feature staff members of the Access Board or of the ADA centers. And then there are a couple of in-person trainings opportunities as well. There's an annual ADA symposium that they do each year, and also some ADA coordinator conferences in this fall and in the spring. And those are great opportunities to continue your education, but also to get in contact with other people who do the work that you do, who are knowledgeable about the things that you're trying to know. Great way to build relationships and learn. I'm going to advance to slide 6 now. Diane, would you like to handle this?
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So once the decision was made to bring on that focused role with Brad's role, it was really important for us to bring along the rest of our team and our board as well, and include this in our strategic planning and our long-standing goals moving forward with these advocacy measures. This helped build the intentional connection and a lot of cross-training for our team, which was great because so many of our team members had, incredible lived experience, but having that technical expertise through Brad's role really helped broaden their knowledge as well. And then, of course, their experiences and expertise helped Brad in learning his role. So it's a really important to have, your full team and leadership on board to move something like this forward. Moving to slide 7.
So now we're going to talk a little bit about the intentional process of building relationships in order to be a better advocate for accessibility in your community. One of the things I want to encourage people to do is to attend different community meetings. A lot of times there are nonprofit collaborative groups that work together between human services and healthcare, and sometimes city or municipal governments as well. There are chambers of commerce a lot of times in communities. Those are great ways to connect to the business community. City and county commission meetings are great as well. Good to meet your municipal officials who control some of the things that you'll be trying to advocate for. It's good to go to these meetings and give public comment about your organization, even if it doesn't pertain to the agenda items that are on the agenda that day. But you can also ask specifically to be on the agenda to give a brief presentation about your organization, what you do, and use that as a platform to sort of build relationships with the commissioners and just let them know that you're there as a resource for individuals with disabilities in your community, but also for them and for governments and businesses, so that you can let them know that you have the expertise and the knowledge and the connection to the disability community to help them be more accessible and inclusive. A lot of communities also have municipal volunteer committees. They have downtown development authorities, planning commissions, equal opportunity offices, and parks and recreation commissions. And these are all great ways to volunteer and be involved in these commissions. And I also wanted to mention too that your center could pay for your time serving on some of these committees if they're if the service on the committee is going to advance the mission of your organization. I'm moving on to slide 8. There's a photo on this slide as well. That's of the city commission chambers in the city of Muskegon. And there are about 10 commissioners, as well as the city manager sitting behind a large bench. Now I'm moving on to slide 8. So when you're building these relationships, you want to offer your center's expertise, introduce your center and its programs, do an in-service training for your local municipalities. You can do things, that are sort of topic focused or more general things. You can do trainings on the ADA. We do a disability decorum presentation, which introduces our organization, talks about the history of the independent living movement and disability civil rights, and also basics on just respectfully interacting with individuals with a disability. You can create opportunities for your consumers to be a part of this feedback and relationship, and get them engaged with their local communities. You can write letters of support for funding opportunities to showcase a focus on increased accessibility. The Michigan Department of Natural Resources has really done something pretty cool where for their grant programs, they're now giving additional points to grant applicants who get in contact with disability groups to provide feedback on their plans. So that's allowed us an opportunity to review some plans for park improvements and engage in a conversation about what's good, what isn't, and provide feedback. And then eventually, if we agree with the improvements that they're making and believe that they do improve access, we can write a letter of support to help them get that funding, which will ideally increase the access at the park that they're writing the grant for. And it's also important to use data to highlight the importance of accessible recreation in our area. Diane mentioned earlier that that recreation is huge in our area. It brings a lot of tourism. Just making sure that, you let people know that increasing access opens up a larger customer base and allows more people to come to your area. One of the things that I like to say when talking to folks about, the sort of economic benefit is that you're not just creating these opportunities for an individual with a disability, you're also creating it for the people that might be with them. If a person with a disability wants to go out to eat, they might be with other people, and they're not going to go someplace that is inaccessible. So it's important to take that into consideration as well. I mean, most people, when they go out to eat, they're with a group of folks, and that's true of individuals with disabilities as well. Getting involved, and I'm on slide 9 now, my apologies. It's important to educate your municipal staff and elected officials. A lot of times people aren't aware what their responsibilities are under the Americans with Disabilities Act. And even if they are, they probably don't have a super clear idea of what they might need to do. And you can do this through formal presentations, as we kind of talked about earlier, or just informal discussions. As I mentioned earlier, I think it's important just to go to these meetings where your community gathers and have conversations with people about what your center does, how it functions, what you can, what benefit you provide to the community, and how you can be a resource for them. A lot of municipal ADA coordinators often have other primary responsibilities. So a lot of them are equal opportunity office folks or HR, and their ADA coordinator responsibilities are often something that they do as needed. It's not something that they know a ton about. At the ADA symposium, they usually ask people a question where they say, how many of you got hired to be an ADA coordinator? And not very many people raise their hands. And then they ask again, how many of you came to work one day and you were told that you were now going to be the ADA coordinator? And so many people raise their hands. So a lot of people, this is something that's an extra of their job. It's not something that they know a lot about. So you can position yourself to be a resource and educate that person or the government in general about what their responsibilities are. And governments with less than 50 employees, which is pretty common in a rural area, are not required to have an ADA coordinator. So they might not have anybody on staff who knows anything about the Americans with Disabilities Act. We're going to talk a little bit about developing your expertise as an additional revenue source for your Center for Independent Living. Centers are charged with resource development in their federal regulations. There's a lot of work going on right now in conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. You can come alongside that and let people know that disability is a part of human diversity. If you can be a person of color or a member of the LGBTQ community, but you could also be a person with a disability. It transcends all other identifiers. Another thing is, people might say, well, you're a center, it's part of your mission to do this work, and that is true. But there are private consulting firms who operate all over the country who will charge a lot more to do this work and have less or no connection to the disability community. So you can, position yourselves as knowledgeable and also connected to the disability community, and you have an edge over, these private firms who will come in and charge a lot more money to do the work that you're able to do. And it's important to stay rooted in your role of advocacy and inclusion. You're advocating for above and beyond the bare minimum compliance of the ADA, and it's important to educate people about that and to let people know that the ADA is a bare minimum standard. It's not meant to be it doesn't always provide full access and inclusion. Going to slide 11. Sometimes when you're working with municipalities, you might want to help them develop an action plan. You may develop a service agreement. Sometimes you can develop a service contract or agreement that where they might pay you to do accessibility reviews for parks or playgrounds, for their public buildings. You can evaluate public rights of way, so sidewalks and street crossings. You can help them create better accessibility at temporary events. You know, if you have a county fair or a music festival or something like that, you can help advise on those as well and to make sure that they're as accessible as they can be. You can also help review design plans, and that's something that we've done for some of the DNR grants, but also for our local communities in general. We'll show some examples a little bit later. You can also audit their policies and procedures. You can make sure that their hiring practices are not discriminatory, make sure that they don't have discriminatory practices on how people can access information, make sure their websites are accessible. You can help them develop transition plans. So if you do an accessibility review, you'll likely make recommendations on how they can fix something. And a transition plan is going to say how they're going to fix it, when they're going to fix it, and who's in charge of it, and potentially how much it costs. I always tell folks that I'm not a contractor or an engineer. I don't really know how much it's going to cost to fix things, but I can give suggestions on how they might do it. And then you can provide ongoing technical assistance. So, oftentimes they have sort of one-off quick questions that they might call about. And you can do that with or without a service contract as well. They can call and ask questions. You want to be able to provide the information to them. Also, we are called to do this and as a part of our systems advocacy work, right? To provide this information, to make our communities more accessible. But I think having a service plan creates some financial buy-in from the municipalities. If this is something that you offer them for free, they might just have you do it because it's free to them and they may never look at it. But if it's something that they're paying for, that creates a little bit more interest, and they want to make sure that it's something that they're going to use if it's an investment for them. Moving on to slide 12 now. So we're going to talk a little bit about the accessibility basics in parks and recreation. I'm not going to go into a ton of technical detail because there's a lot of it, but I just want to talk about some of the things that are required to have accessibility, where you can find that information, and just give a few examples. So there are two main sources for accessibility standards for parks and recreation. So the first is the Americans with Disabilities Act 2010 standards. And these apply to places of public accommodation, commercial facilities, and local and state government facilities in new construction, alterations, and additions. So places of public accommodation are any private business that does business with the public. And the ADA standards are required for new construction, or if you're going to alter something. As a general rule, if you touch it, you fix it. So if something was built a long time ago, you want to update it, you have to make sure it's compliant with the ADA moving forward. And those standards are found in Chapter 10 under Recreation Facilities. And then the second is the Architectural Barriers Act, which applies to facilities designed, built, altered, or leased with federal funds. And that's also in Chapter 10 of the Recreation Facilities. These are not enforceable for people covered under Title II or III of the ADA, but they're still considered best practices. And I just want to enforce too that these are bare minimum standards. Also, the Architectural Barriers Act standards there are additional things that are required to be accessible under there, but you still want to use those as bare minimum standards as you're moving forward. It's likely that after some additional federal rulemaking, those will apply to Title II and III entities under the ADA. Moving on to slide 13. So the Americans with Disabilities Act, Chapter 10 covers recreation facilities. I just want to clarify too that I'm going to talk briefly about some of, example requirements for some of these, but it's important to remember that at any of your parks and rec facilities, you're going to have requirements to make sure that there are accessible routes to and from each of these things. If you have restrooms, drinking fountains, benches, those are all going to be required to meet ADA or ABA standards, depending on what is covered. So Chapter 10 covers amusement rides. New amusement rides are required to have a wheelchair space or a transfer platform that allows someone to transfer out of a wheelchair to access the ride. Recreational boating facilities are required to have accessible piers and boat slips. Fishing piers and platforms. If you have a fishing pier at a community park, 25% of the railing needs to be no greater than 34 inches above the ground. And this is to allow, someone who may be using a wheelchair to better cast or reel a fish up over the edge. Miniature golf facilities are required to have a accessible driving area as well as an accessible route alongside that would allow someone to reach over and hit the ball. Golf facilities don't traditionally let people drive their golf carts on the green, but if somebody is using an adaptive golf cart, the golf course is required to allow them to go onto the green or to the driving area. And play areas are required to have access via a transfer system or a ramp, and that is determined by the number of elevated play components that are provided. And so that stuff gets pretty complicated and technical, but if you are interested in finding that, the Access Board website has a ton of great information about that and helps you navigate when the requirements apply and how they apply. Swimming pools, wading pools, and spas have accessibility requirements, could provide access using a lift or a sloped entry. And shooting facilities with firing positions. So if there's a shooting facility, they're required to have an accessible route to and from each firing position, as well as required turning space. So a 5-foot circle that would allow someone to turn around. Moving on to slide 14 now. So this is covering the Architectural Barriers Act, Recreational Facilities, Chapter 10. And so the Architectural Barriers Act applies to all of the things that were discussed under the ADA, as well as these additional things. So outdoor constructed features, things like grills, benches, picnic tables, those are going to be they need to have required amounts of clear space around them. They need to have accessible routes to and from. Picnic tables are required to have wheelchair seating, and that's determined by the amount of linear feet along the edge of a picnic table. And you'd have to take the total number of picnic tables, look at your linear feet, and then decide how many wheelchair spaces you would need to have. If you have camping sites that have accessible or mobility features, those are also going to be required to have accessible parking spots, and that applies not only to standard vehicle spaces, but also recreational vehicle spaces. tent pads and tent platforms. So some parks provide accessible tent pads where it's a raised platform that someone could set up their tent on, which would allow a wheelchair user to transfer out of their wheelchair at the level of the entry of their tent. Camping shelters, viewing areas, outdoor recreation access routes, trails, beach access routes are all going to have accessibility requirements under the Architectural Barriers Act. Moving on to slide 15. So when you go out and you are evaluating some of these things, if that's something that you've decided you wanted to do, there are a couple of resources that you can use. There's a great website called adachecklist.org, and someone has developed these really great handy checklists that cover each feature that you might need to evaluate when you're going through a facility or a recreation facility. And some of the checklists that are provided allow notes and photos to be added. They're fillable documents, and you can insert your photos right in there. You could add additional notes. I think the formatting for those can be a little messy, and there's, not every barrier is going to apply to each facility that you're evaluating. So there's going to be lots of extra space. And for me, I feel like it's more important to focus on the barriers than to just have empty space for things that are not wrong with a facility. So there are 4 different priorities identified in a standard facility checklist. The first priority is the approach and the entrance, which covers parking, doorways, sidewalks. The second is access to goods and services. So that'll be interior spaces, hallways, built-in counters. The third is toilet rooms, which applies to restrooms. And then the fourth priority is other elements such as public telephones, drinking fountains, fire alarms. So when I write a report, under each priority, I give any context that might be relevant, and then have findings. So any of the barriers that I've encountered, I put those in there. I take pictures, I take notes of everything that I've found. And then there's, for each finding, I put the applicable standards under a section after that called standards. So that'll be the literal text and any drawings from the access board that are available on what that is supposed to look like, what the standard is, how it's supposed to look. And then a recommendation under that. I think it's, some of the recommendations for the that are built into the checklists are a little bit lackluster and not super helpful. So for instance, if you have a stall in a restroom that's too small, the recommendation in the checklist might be, make restroom stall the proper size, but you could say something a little bit more helpful in your own version and say, move the partition and remove the second toilet to create the required 56 by 60 inch clear space for an accessible stall, and also install, rear and side grab bars. So I think, there's a couple of ways that you could make your own process for this. But I have found this to be helpful and allows me to make things a little bit more digestible. I want to make sure that the things that I'm producing are helpful to the people I'm giving them to. I don't want them to be confused and turned off. So there in the chat, you can see there's the link to adachecklist.org. I'll also upload a sample accessibility review to our materials section on the site. That it won't be anything extensive, but just sort of an example so you can see what it looks like. We do have a sort of page on the front of our reviews that say, who Disability Network West Michigan is, what our mission is, and also, lets people know that we're not an enforcement agency of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The ADA is enforced federally. We don't have any authority to do that. Our purpose in doing this is strictly to provide information and resources so that these places know how they can be more accessible and so that they can use the information to become more accessible. Moving on to slide 16 now. Follow-up. Yes?
There are a couple of questions in the chat.
Sure.
What, if you want to take those real quick. One is by Joni. The company I work for recently resurfaced in our large parking lot. They have 6 spaces facing each other. There's a 5-foot access aisle making 1 space van accessible spot, but the facing spot one would need to back in for van access. There is no access aisle between the other spaces. Do they need some access aisle between all spaces designated accessible?
Yeah, so each accessible space is required to have an access aisle or be adjacent to an access aisle. They are sometimes allowed to share an access aisle, but each accessible space should have access to an access aisle. And if there's a van accessible space, it's required to be 11 foot wide with a 5-foot access aisle. The others are required to be 8 foot wide with a 5-foot access aisle.
Thank you. There's another question, but I will save that towards the end because I know we'll cover that a little bit. It's a question about how we decide what our fees are for the ADA services. And then the information you just requested, Joni would like to know where he or she can find that info.
So Joni, you can go to the Access Board website and I believe, there's a big, if you go to the section, guidelines and standards, there's an Americans with Disabilities Act section. And under that, there will be a chapter breakdown on the side, and you can find the parking spaces specs under there. Chapter 2 is going to have the scoping requirements, so how many they're required to have. And then I believe the technical requirements are in chapter 4. Diane, do you want me to address the other question that's in there as well?
Sure. Yeah, I thought maybe we could address that towards the end because I know
Okay.
we'll be talking about that more. It's a great question. Thanks, Brad.
Yeah. Yep. All right, so on slide 16 here, I just want to say, the importance of follow-up, I always let people know that when I hand you my report, that's not the end of our relationship, right? I want to make sure that the report I'm giving you is something that you understand and that you can use. And so I'm always available for follow-up questions, to go back out and take a look at something and help explain what I meant, if they need further clarifications. And just, it's important to follow up and see what people are doing. Are they making use of the report that you've given them? Have they come up with a plan to address it? Have they decided what their most urgent fixes are and how they're going to address them? So moving on to slide 17 here. So one example of a service agreement that we had recently done is with the city of Whitehall, which is in northern Muskegon County, and it's a community of 2,700 residents, so a very small community. They identified items that they wanted reviewed, and so we reviewed their city hall. We looked at their downtown sidewalks and on-street parking and storefronts. These weren't, I didn't, measure each storefront to look at all of the technical requirements for that, but what I basically was identifying which storefronts did not have an accessible entry. So if they had a step, they got marked as inaccessible, and this was something that the city was going to follow up and try to address. We did both of their public parking lots, and then their 7 city parks, which included multiple sports facilities. So there were tennis courts, basketball courts, baseball and softball fields, playgrounds, and a municipal marina. I should have mentioned earlier too that sports facilities like baseball fields, tennis courts, those are going to have requirements for an accessible route to and from the area, and also accessible routes to player and spectator seating, and they're going to have requirements for wheelchair spaces at both player and spectator seating as well. All right, moving on to slide 18. So this is an aerial photo of Goodrich Park and White Lake Marina in Whitehall. This is just an example of one of the parks that we had to do. It was pretty involved. So the White Lake Municipal Marina has 50 boat slips for seasonal and transient boats. They have restrooms and showers for marina users and Wi-Fi access for boaters. Goodrich Park also has restrooms for park users. They have picnic tables, grills, a picnic shelter with electricity, playground equipment, a gazebo, 960 feet of bicycle/pedestrian paths, and benches with a viewing and parking area. And the photo shows this park, which is right along the edge of White Lake. There were a number of issues. This review ended up being 40+ pages long. It was quite extensive. It had been a while since things had been updated. The playground in particular is going to need some attention. Moving on to slide 19, and I'm going to let Diane take over here to talk about a couple more examples.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. So, the exciting part of our efforts here have been the engagement from our local communities has really been quite supportive and exciting. Brad mentioned that, many of these entities just simply are not aware of their responsibilities, but oftentimes we find there is a desire to increase their accessibility efforts. They just really don't know where to start or how to go about that. So being able to connect with them on these issues and build that relationship has been absolutely incredible. Another way we've been increasing local accessibility is that in the state of Michigan, centers have identified the GO logo, or the accessible icon, as a legislative priority to help change the perception of people with disabilities. And the GO logo transforms the international symbol of access from one of a person with a disability in a stationary setting to one of active independence. And so on the slide here, we have that GO logo with the individual in a moving forward position, as opposed to that stationary stance that is attributed to the international symbol of access. This is a bill that Centers for Independent Living in the state of Michigan have brought forward to both the House and the Senate. And we've been successful in getting it through both so far. But what this has allowed us to do locally is to talk to our businesses and our local municipalities on updating their logos within our communities ahead of the bill being passed. The bill would help encourage the removal of the term handicapped from signs and other communications at state and local levels. And the legislation would also only affect signs going forward. Any new placement or replacement of accessible signage would essentially require this new Go logo. But we've already been successful in having our local businesses and municipalities adopt this through local advocacy measures. And then moving on to slide 20. Another example of improving our accessible recreation, we've mentioned beaches in our area a couple of times now. If you haven't been to West Michigan, please come visit us. It's so beautiful, but we're lacking accessible beaches. And so in 2 of our most popular local beaches, we've installed boardwalks to make them more accessible. And we did this through a creative fundraising effort where we actually sold the boardwalk sections, and people could purchase them and have them engraved or have it dedicated to a loved one, and write messages on them. So the community actually paid for these boardwalks through our efforts in creating these. So that's been a really exciting addition locally for us.
Can I add something here, Diane?
Yes, please.
I just wanted to add to, this isn't necessarily a direct result of our own advocacy, but one of the other cool things that has sort of happened to increase beach access is that Muskegon State Park now has a track chair that you can reserve. So if you're an individual with a disability who uses a wheelchair, you can call the Muskegon State Park and they will bring a track chair to the beach that you can transfer from your wheelchair into that, and you can go up and down the beach for several hours. And those have been pretty cool.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. Moving to slide 21. So on this slide, we have a picture of a newly installed accessible kayak and boat launch on our Muskegon River. The accessible kayak boat launch features a ramp to enter and exit, as well as an area to stage a kayak or a canoe with a transfer platform, allowing someone to transfer from their wheelchair into their boat before pushing off into the water. And so this was an effort with a local small township in getting this installed, and again, having that buy-in from the community. And now we use it for staff outings or to feature to our community, some of these updates that are happening with inclusive recreation in our area. And then moving on to slide 22. And back to you, Brad.
Yeah, so I get particularly excited about playgrounds. I think, if you're going to deal with prejudice and dealing with discrimination, I think it's best to start with children. And so kids are, going to playgrounds. It's, better if they can interact with people who are different than they are. And so a couple of exciting things that we've been able to do in the city of Muskegon is to improve accessible playgrounds. So this particular playground here is on Pier Marquette Beach. It is a blue and green structure with ramped access. And so our CIL got involved with the city of Muskegon when this project was going, and originally the plans were only providing 30% of access to the via the ramp, and then eventually after working with our organization, they have increased it to nearly 70%. And because of this work, the city of Muskegon is now reaching out to us about playground projects in advance before they decide which ones they're doing, and they're looking for input on their proposals. And so that has led us to this final example here. which is a playground in the city of Muskegon that they are updating. In the photo, you will see a blue and white ramped structure. This is just a rendering of the playground. It's not the actual structure that hasn't been built yet. But the city reached out to us and they had 3 different proposals for this playground. And they asked specifically in their request for proposals here to provide optimal accessibility on this playground. So this playground provides ramped access to 26 of the 28 elevated elements. And it also has a unitary rubber surface so that there's access to all of the ground level components as well. And, you know, this is, I think, just a good example of some of the positives that have come out of our very deliberate attempts to build relationships with our municipalities. You know, they're reaching out to us to review these, to do, you know, I ended up having conversations with the manufacturers, making sure that the figures that they had in each of the plans was accurate. This one, the community voted, and there were 3 different options. This was the option that the community thought was the best as well. And so that our visions aligned there. And there was a second one as well that they asked for above bare minimum standards, but not quite this level of optimum accessibility. And our preference for that park and the preference of the public was different, but what ended up happening was the city agreed to take the accessible elements from the proposal that we liked and ask that they be designed into the proposal for that the community chose. So that one will now have ramped access to more of the structure and also provide a unitary rubber surface that will allow greater access on the ground. With that, I'm moving to slide 24, which is just if anybody has questions, I'll look at the Q&A here.
And Brad, while you're doing that, I want to just to mention how we've included our consumers and the individuals in our community in some of these projects. For the Pier Marquette Playground, for example, we were able to bring together parents of children with disabilities, the kids themselves who had a myriad, you know, spectrum of different disabilities, and talk to them about what elements of a playground, you know, are frustrating or have worked well for them in other areas possibly. And with that direct input, not only from our consumers, but our staff, being able to increase that accessibility from 30 to 70% was a direct result of that, and is a really important component, we think, when looking at and reviewing these plans. It's great to have Brad's technical expertise, but then to also layer that with the individuals who would be utilizing the equipment or those spaces themselves has really elevated it to that next level.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the chat, we have a question about how we decide what our fees are for ADA services. And I'll tell you that that's kind of a work in progress. You know, essentially what we're looking to do is to cover the cost of staff time to go out and do these things. And particularly the reviews don't take a ton of time. Writing the report takes a lot of time because, you know, you want to make sure that you're giving good suggestions and you have to insert all of the standards that are relevant. It takes a long time. And we're engaging with our other centers across the state of Michigan with their ADA coordinators and other people who do this. And we're trying to figure out a sort of solidified fee structure We haven't really established that yet, but the goal is to cover staff time and make sure that it's something that is generating or covering staff time, making sure that our time is paid for.
And I did have a question as well on the legislation that we brought forward. I'm going to drop the link to the legislation and the specific wording of those bills into the chat. We have a website specifically for the Go logo in our state. So that was another great question, and I will paste that in the chat.
And on the last slide here, we just have our contact information. I always like to offer the opportunity that if you have questions, feel free to reach out to us. If I can't answer your question, I'll try and find people who can, or at least point you in the correct direction for resources. And I'm sure Diane will say the same. And also, there are some slides, additional slides that you will find in the uploaded presentation that contain some advocacy strategy do's and don'ts. There's a slide about different tools you might need when doing an accessibility review. Thank you all so much for having us today and for allowing us to talk about this.
Thank you all. Remember, when you close out your screen, there will be an evaluation that pops up. Please do fill that out. We use them to help make our conference stronger. Thank you so much to Diane and Brad for this very important information.
Thanks for having us.